Throughout World War II, there were many generals who ordered war crimes, and who were responsible for slaughter, torture, and death of people who should have been given a form of protection as prisoners of war. The Japanese forces were involved in huge amounts of war crimes and crimes against humanity during the conflict, and in the battles before the war in Asia. There were even 2 officers who had a competition to see who could execute 100 people the quickest using a sword, and local media outlets even commentated on this sick event as if it was a sport. At the end of the war, a number of senior Japanese generals were brought to war crimes trials and were condemned for their actions. Some were executed on the gallows inside of occupied prisons, but others were for their crimes dragged kicking and screaming to firing ranges, where they were tied to a stake and they had their heads covered with a cap before a firing squad shot straight into them. This was the fate of Japanese Lieutenant General Fukuei Shimpei, who was responsible for a terrible incident in which prisoners of war were treated awfully, and some were forced to witness brutal executions. To support, please make sure to subscribe. Little is known about the life of Lieutenant General Fukuei Shimpei, but he would have been a very experienced military officer and probably joined the Japanese army from a very young age. This was normal for young men inside of Japan, and they were told that a career inside the armed forces was something that was the most honourable thing to do, and to die for your emperor was something that would reward the soldier's family. But General Shimpei would have risen throughout the ranks alongside other Japanese officers such as Yamashita, but he became known about during the Second World War for his actions inside of Singapore. The fall of Singapore was one of the biggest military disasters in history, and the British Army experienced their largest ever surrender. The Japanese forces may have been outnumbered, but the Japanese attacked the weaker parts of Singapore and established beachheads, and they pushed into the land. There were many civilians who were trapped and stuck inside of cities still held by the Allied forces, and the Japanese then began to bomb the civilian infrastructure and water supply in an attempt to make the nation crumble. General Yamashita was the one who led the attack, and he was the one who accepted the British surrender. The Japanese would put the nation to the sword, and within days of the British surrender, they conducted the Selarang Massacre, in which anti-Japanese elements in Singapore were purged, and this resulted in, it's believed, the deaths of between 40 to 50,000 people. The aim of this attack was to intimidate the Chinese community, which was considered one of the most serious enemies of the Japanese, but after the capture of Singapore, there were around 80,000 British, Indian, Australian and local soldiers who became prisoners of war, and many were subjected to rough and brutal treatment, and they were locked up inside of prisons and prisoner of war camps. Lieutenant General Fukuei Shimpei was given command of many prisoners who were housed inside of the Selarang Barracks. There were many Australian and British POWs who were locked up there, inside of the Japanese camp, which was based in Changi in Singapore. But there was a revolt that took place on the 30th of August 1942, and the Japanese had recaptured and rounded up 4 prisoners of war who had escaped. General Shimpei, who had recently arrived at the barracks to oversee the prisoners, wanted the British and Australian POWs to sign a no-escape pledge, in which they would promise not to escape and run away. This was enforced due to the escape of the 4 prisoners from the nearby Changi prison. The pledge read, "I, the undersigned, hereby solemnly swear on my honour that I will not under any circumstances attempt to escape." Everyone refused to sign except 3 people, and the prisoners believed it was their duty to escape if they could, and then rejoin the fight against the Japanese. Prisoners of war did technically have the right to try and escape, but they were supposed to not be punished if they were then recaptured. But we all know that this was not the case, and many prisoners would be executed when recaptured. The Selarang Barracks was originally built to hold 800 men, but around 17,000 men were rammed into the parade ground. One POW wrote of the situation inside the site that, "The first and most urgent problem we had to face up to was a lack of toilet facilities. Each barracks building had about 4 to 6 toilets, which were flushed from small cisterns on the roof. But the Japanese cut the water off, and these toilets could not be used. The Japanese only allowed 1 water tap to be used, and people used to line up in the early hours of the morning, and that queue would go on all day. You were allowed 1 bottle of water per man per day, just 1 quart for your drinking, washing and everything else. Not that there was much washing done under the circumstances. The conditions of the site were terrible, but the prisoners refused to sign the promise not to escape, and with this General Shimpei was furious. With this he organised brutal reprisals and ordered the commander of the British and Australian soldiers in Changi to attend the executions of the 4 men who had escaped from the prison. Their executions were carried out by Indian National Army guards with their rifles, and following the initial shots being fired and not killing the men, the wounded men begged for their ordeals to be over and had to be finished off. The men went back and told the others about the executions, but the prisoners yet again refused to sign the no-escape order. They were given little food and water, and little toilet facilities as well as care, and because of this dysentery broke out, and many people began to get sick. The prisoner commanders said their men would then sign the pledge under duress, and it was claimed that the requirements by the Imperial Japanese Army, issued under their Order No. 17, dated 31st of August 42, that all ranks of the POW Camp Changi should be given the opportunity to sign a certificate of promise not to escape, has now been amended in a revised Imperial Japanese Army Order No. 17, dated 2nd of September 42, to a definite order that all officers, NCOs and men of the POW camp shall sign this undertaking. I therefore now order that these certificates will be signed by all ranks, and handed by area commanders to command headquarters by 11 o'clock on the 5th of September 42. The circumstances in which I have been compelled to issue this order were made the subject of Selarang Special Order No. 3, which will be issued later. Many of the prisoners of war signed the requirements with false names, and many Australians signed it with the name of the infamous criminal Ned Kelly. The prisoners were then allowed back to the other areas of the camp, and this ended the standoff and very rough treatment. But still things were bad inside the barracks. At the end of the Second World War, Lieutenant General Fukuei Shimpei was captured by the Allied forces, and many told of his command of the Selarang Barracks, and he was brought to a war crimes trial. He was for his actions condemned to death for crimes against humanity, and the murder and slaughter of Australian prisoners of war. On the 27th of April 1946, General Shimpei was led out of his prison cell to his execution. He was to be shot by a firing squad for his crimes, as he was a military officer. A newspaper article from the time told of his execution. It was said that stocky Japanese General Shimpei died before the firing squad today. Retribution came 4 years after he had herded thousands of Australians into a prison camp designed for hundreds. 4 years after he had ordered the execution of 2 Australians for filling their water bottles. He had a strange last request to make, as he was taken from his cell in Changi prison and into the glaring island sunlight. He smiled apologetically and murmured that he would like to signal immediately before the volley was fired. He wanted to direct the firing squad. Regarding the execution, it was also written, Shimpei wanted to say farewell to his emperor. He was marched to a wall, he turned to face the levelled rifles, and just before they fired the officer signalled. Banzai, the general cried, and then long live the emperor, and he thanked the officer. It was then said, almost in the same instant his body was hurled against the wall by the firing squad's bullets. He had been secured to a firing post, and had also had a white cap placed over his head in the final moments, so he could not see the firing squad who instantly killed him. At the end of the Second World War, there were many different Japanese generals who were led out for their executions at the hands of the Allied forces. Some were hanged on the gallows, others were shot on firing ranges. They were considered the men who had ordered the war crimes against many civilians and prisoners of war, and for this they needed to be punished in the post-war belief. General Shimpei was the commander in charge of thousands of POWs who were treated terribly, and for ordering executions, he was condemned and shot. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.